Hello, hello. Thank you all for joining us. This is actually our last session of Denver Startup Week for each of the tracks. So glad that you're here. I hope that you come to the closing bash after. I know we're expecting a lot of faces, so hope to see you there. I also hope that you learn a lot from these leaders up on stage. I got to join their prep session and already learned a lot. I was taking pages of notes, so I'm very confident in what they're going to get to speak about today. So with that, I'm thrilled to introduce the culture equation. We have Zach Doms, Kurt Roberts, and Jeremy Edmonds. So take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you've been having a great day and a good session to end the week on. So I'm super excited for this. I am working in the culture development space. I've also had 2 successful exits as a founder at this point. Successful exits as in both of those startups are out of business now. But so I've learned a few things, I think, on that journey so far. I say successful because, yeah, there's a lot of learning experiences in that. And I've always found it pretty interesting how as good of a product you might develop or good of a revenue model you develop behind that, you always end up kind of coming against this people element, right? The culture element of the organization. So I'm excited to kind of unpack that with these 2 amazing individuals on how do we start to build culture and a people strategy in the early stages that allow us to thrive and grow in the early stages as a startup. So fellas, I'd love to jump into it with you 2. If you don't mind, maybe we do some short introductions, but I'd also love to jump right into the discussion around, like, what have you seen as culture's role in the early days as a startup? And Kurt, why don't you jump in here first?
Okay, short intro first, and then
that's perfect.
Answer that question. Okay, so I'm president of Sondermind. Sondermind is a local tech startup. Goes back to about 2015. Has gone through the Series C round of funding now, and we're chugging along and built a big company, but still plenty of room left to go. So it's fun to be on that journey. Hit that question one more time, make sure I hit the bullseye on it.
I love that, yeah. So thinking about culture in the early days as a startup.
Yeah, so I wasn't on Sondermind's team when the company was first started, but I was a venture capitalist at the time, a partner in a seed fund called Kickstart, and I led the seed round in the company in the spring of 2018. So I've been on the board since the spring of 2018, so I've been able to see how the company has evolved and changed over the years. I think what I saw at Sondermind early on would be typical to what most of you would see and experience in any startup early on. You have a pretty good sense of what's going to generate revenue for the company, but you're doing a boatload of experimentation and testing and trial, and doing that as fast and as inexpensively as you possibly can so that you really dial the business model. So it is a time of a lot of chaos, but a ton of learning and agility, I would say, would be the things that characterize the culture most there. And also the 100 or so companies, that I had a chance to invest in or be a part of while a VC, you see the same pattern everywhere, right? And the best companies do that incredibly well.
Yeah, it's always interesting, especially, well, I'm excited to talk a little bit more about as you mature and grow as well as how do you maintain that agility? And I know that's something we talked about being really important. Sometimes as you become process heavy, you lose that atmosphere that made you successful in the early days. So something we'll unpack a little bit as well. So Jeremy, welcome to the stage with us. Would love to, what's some of the things you're working on in your role in an organization? And then how have you seen culture start to play a role in those early days?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Jeremy Edmonds, Vice President of People and Culture for Snooze. If you are a Denverite or know Snooze, you're probably craving pineapple upside down pancakes right now. But Snooze was founded on a simple principle that a stack of pancakes can change the world. And what's been remarkable in our organization is this idea that when you are building that culture, if you can rally a group of people around an idea, around a concept, where you start to build that mission, that vision, the ideas of what you want to do in that shared language, that's the foundation in those early days. It's thinking about who you want to be now, who you want to be in 5 years, and who you want to be in 20 years, and what is the 1, 2, 3 things that you want to carry that through. And that's what I've loved about Snooze the most, is we founded ourselves on this idea about changing the world. And in 18 years, that has not changed for our organization. Every single day, every single snoozer, every single person that enters our restaurant sets out to change the world. And we haven't wavered. We've done it differently. Back in the old days, it was about being in the community. Now it's about giving money to the community. It's about sustainability, and how we do those things has changed over the years, but the core principles of who we are didn't. So when you can establish your mission, your vision, your values, the systems on which you want to operate, and then build under those the idea of the behaviors that support them, and then systems, processes, and tools that support that, you start with that foundational work that you need in the early days that allows you to then continue to grow and scale.
Which I'm excited I'm gonna bring it back to you in a second, but having an actual equation behind it as well. So this will be fun to talk about. And for some more introduction's sake, I'm now president at a company called Achieve Engagement. We're a global HR people leader community and network. And we're all about rethinking the ways in which we can achieve engagement. So on one end, we work more closely with HR tech companies on their go-to-market strategy and their product, and helping those solutions develop to impact the employee experience. But then we have our HR network of CHROs, CPOs, and people like that to help arm them with new insights, research, and best practices that then they can take in-house. So super excited to learn with this crew here today. So let's start to maybe discuss that foundation here, Jeremy, and think about, in the early days, and even as our organization grows and develops and matures, there's kind of that foundation. And at Snooze Eatery, you even talked about an actual equation that you built out for this, which I love, because sometimes culture can be this somewhat fluffy, intangible thing that you kind of can't touch and grasp a hold on, and that sometimes is the biggest barriers for founders or executives to get on board with it. So I think having an actual framework to it allows it to be more strategic. So can you break that down for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll tell you kind of a funny story about this, but when I started at Snooze 5 years ago, I got called into a meeting with our CEO within the first month that I was sitting there. And his challenge to me is, we need to dive into our engagement scores, dive into the engagement of our snoozers. But what I don't want you to do is come into this meeting and say, our engagement is 81%. He's like, I can see a number. He's like, help me understand what 81% means. So I've been in the HR space now for 20 years, worked for Google, Facebook, a lot of the big companies that are out there, and I've been fascinated with culture my entire time and studying it. So I sat down and started to think, how do I describe engagement, which isn't here's the output, but what actually is engagement? And started pouring through the numbers that we had at Snooze, looking at the old data that I had from other companies, and what I quickly discovered was a couple of things. Engagement in culture starts by understanding what culture is. And there's 5 powers to culture. It's who you are, what you are, your mission, vision, values, belief, and shared language. Your second power is the behaviors and norms that support that. Your third power is the systems, tools, processes underneath that, the stories that yields, and then how people act when no one's looking. So I was like, I was trying to come up with a cool anagram or the 5 C's, but I couldn't. But I was like, C to the 5th power. So I started playing with math. I love math. I've been fascinated by it. And I was like, but how we operate matters. And I realized that your cultural foundation is when you take culture plus your true north or your operational excellence. That is how you define your culture. And then your culture is impacted or multiplied by the impact that you have on your people. So what came out of this doodling on a whiteboard in my office was C to the 5th power plus O times I equals engagement. And I sat down with my CEO and I'm like, well, I'm going to throw this up and see what he says. And I threw it on the board and he was like, I love this, but now you got to prove it to me. And so through every engagement survey that we've done within the organization, we take that data and pair it up against this idea. And the thing that has come out of this that has been the most remarkable piece is impact. When you can have an impact on the people who work for you, your culture multiplies. And it can multiply up or it can multiply down. We know that any number times a positive number equals a positive. Any number times a negative number equals a negative. So if you have negative impact, if you are doing things in your organization that are negatively impacting, you're going to lose culture. If you're doing things that are positively impacting, you're going to gain culture. And it was kind of fun for me to do, but what's really come out of it is this idea that you can truly quantify culture if you put it to a mathematical equation.
And what I love about that too is you're turning culture into a strategic element to the organization versus it being something that just helps provide us a happier workplace, right? Like I think sometimes that's an annoyance is like, well, yes, we want to be a happy workplace, but we don't want to be a happy workplace that just goes out of business, right? Like we want to be impactful. So it's like, which, interesting enough, fulfillment and happiness often follows from impact. So if you're impacting that, you're going to get what maybe you're originally going for. Kurt, I'd love for you to maybe build off of that a little bit and think about culture's role at SonerMind, as well as some of your experience in some of the larger enterprises out there. How have you helped ensure or see culture maintain its strategic role at the organization and support that impact, as Jeremy talked about?
Yeah, I would say in certain circumstances, and I've seen this in a couple of the companies that I worked for, culture was almost a natural byproduct of the business and the people attracted to that business. So Nike was an extreme example of this, right? Where the company was in the business of sport, physical activity. You could imagine most people who went there had some affinity for that, right? Not an unusual thing to see scholarship collegiate athletes all over the campus among the employee base. People just had a passion for being there and would almost do anything just to be part of that company. And so not surprisingly, you had a culture that reflected that. And that culture had some natural attributes to it. It was all about winning. It was generally oriented around teamwork, a lot of fluidity where people would play different roles at different points in time, pitch in when necessary, and then take a seat on the bench. You would see that literally as a natural outgrowth of the business that the company was in. So that's one of the things that I think shapes cultures quite a bit. Another, I think, and this is, I'm going to speak a little bit to a challenge I think we went through at SonerMind, is that you start with a culture that's very natural for your stage. Early on, I talked about that a minute ago, right? Kind of chaotic, but a ton of learning, a lot of experimentation, people's roles changing every day. Whatever your title is on your business card doesn't necessarily mean anything about the details of what you're doing all the time. And then as companies grow, they naturally start to have to get a little more systematic about how things get done. Roles tend to get a little more precisely defined. Functions get more clearly established. Reporting relationships are more fixed and formal. And the biggest challenge that I've seen for us at SonerMind was maintaining that fast-moving, experimental, agile culture of a startup when you're no longer really a startup. And the challenge is, I think we found this over the last couple of years, if you lose that edge, you also lose a lot of what made you great, what allowed you to build, a first-class company. And so we've intentionally, we actually put, I joined the company last November, and I joined right at the time that we were actually doing a cultural reset, a very formal, intentional cultural reset. And it was all around recapturing essentially the behaviors and habits that we had when we were an earlier stage startup and breaking down a bunch of things that had started to creep in, multiple layers of approvals and people putting these incredibly ornate, perfectly crafted PowerPoint decks together and all that sort of stuff. And we just started systematically ditching all that and built it into the strategic plan. So if you saw the summary of our strategic plan, you would see the description of the changes we wanted to make to the culture this year. Those habits don't die easily, right? And so people are scared about taking risk. Am I really going to get my head chopped off if I go off and do something crazy and it doesn't work? And so we did all kinds of things to try to beat that down, including in our all hands meetings every month, for example. We would celebrate and actually have people get up and talk about their biggest failures from the month before. So it was just this idea of just trying to chip away at the calcification that had built up in the arteries of the company and turn it back into a startup again. And we're 9 months into it, and we just did a report to our board on this, actually. We just had a board meeting and talked about this. I wouldn't call it done, but I would say the recapturing of who we were early happened faster and more successfully than I expected. But it had to be very, very intentional.
Kurt, one of the things that you were talking about there that I love is this idea that as your culture morphed, or as the culture of Sondermind morphed over the years, a lot of it was driven out of new behaviors. You created a behavior of massive PowerPoints. You created a behavior around this. And what oftentimes happens with culture is the shadow of the leaders who are leading it shadows down upon it, and your employees, your people who are surrounding you begin to take on new behaviors that are reflective of that leader, of that leadership culture. Yeah. And that's, it's remarkable hearing you say, we recognize that, now we had to break it and go back to the behaviors that we wanted that actually supported the culture.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts I'll share on that. So when I joined Nike, Phil Knight was still the CEO. And he was the CEO through the entire time I was there up until the very last year, and then stayed on as chairman, and was very, very involved, particularly in sports marketing on a daily basis, up until as recently as I heard. The culture of Nike, to a great degree, was an artifact of Phil Knight's personality and quirks. I mean, you could literally point to quirks of Phil's and see them manifest in the organization, right? And the fact that he had been continuously with the place through its entire history, not surprising, it never had the chance to kind of stray too much from what he established as being. The challenges that I described that happened at Sondermind that crept in, that we decided we had to kind of break, you could attribute mostly to one person. And that one person's past experience and behavior and expectations, and then the whole organization starts to adjust to it, and before you know it, it's subconscious, right? And so, yeah, in this case, we had to actually change out a situation with the person in order to provide freedom, basically, to unfreeze those behaviors and shift them back in the direction we wanted.
Don't you love how these guys talk about this stuff? It's like the arteries of the company, in the shadow of the leader. I mean, these things are so incredibly important, and I think great analogies to it. And I want to transition maybe into the leadership role in all this in a second, but also, Jeremy, one of the things you told me about as Kurt kind of was talking about, as you grow and scale, you feel this pressure to operationalize certain things, standardize certain behaviors, you lose that edge that made you successful in the first place. And you talked to us about this growth that Snooze Eatery went from 10 locations to 70 or 72. Tell us about that experience. How did you maybe maintain a strategic edge and culture that made you successful while you scaled and growed across, the nation here?
And that's been an important thing to us as we think about our culture. One of the key things we wanted to ensure that we didn't lose with every new restaurant was who we are. And who we are is truly defined by our vision, it's defined by our values, it's defined by our true north, which is our guest. And across each of those categories, how we maintain that and how we've stayed true to that is a shared language that we've created internally so that when we talk about training people, when we talk about serving the guest, when we talk about how sustainability is important to us, when we talk about our work in our community, we have a consistent message no matter if you're standing in a restaurant in Atlanta or you're standing at the original ballpark location just down the street. And that comes by creating that shared, not only language around it, but that shared vision that when we hire people, from the moment we interview you to the moment we hire you to the moment we onboard you to 3 more years down the road, that message is consistent all the way through it. And when we see variances to that, we take action, so that we don't hopefully get into a situation where we've now veered so far away from who we are and what we want to stand for. And that's what's kept our culture so true for 18 years. And there's been bumps and there's been, moments and areas that have not been as successful in that, but it's recognizing it early and not letting it become the norm and reshifting back to what you believe in and what's core to who you are.
What are some examples of action in those scenarios? Because sometimes I'm thinking okay, I want to be able to take action as a leader or founder when these scenarios come up, but it also can be extremely uncomfortable. It might be involving a difficult conversation, making tough decisions to potentially to let someone go. What is some of the actions, I'm just, for some of the individuals here who's I need to take action, what might that look like, or how do you go about that?
Yeah, when we think about taking action, we believe that everybody has a chance to be aligned with a vision or the mission or the goal or the thing that we're talking about. So the first action that we always take is education. This is why it's important to us. This is the why. We talk about the snooze why all the time, and our why is to serve our guests and our snoozers so that they create a shared morning experience so that people can come in and have craveable dishes. And so we always go back to the why. Why is this important to that vision? Why is this important to the organization? Why is this important to your actions as a snoozer within our 4 walls? From education, if they're still not aligning and they're still not getting there, it's taking it to the next level where we have the courageous conversation and we challenge. So education to challenge, and that challenge is, all right, the expectation for you in this role is to act and show up in a certain way, and if you're not aligned with that, why? Help us understand. We always seek to understand the why from their perspective. And if it's still a misalignment because now you understand our why, we understand why you won't align, it's the hard discussion where we have to terminate. Because ultimately we can't allow somebody to come into our culture that's not going to be aligned with the greater good of it, because ultimately that doesn't serve the one person we're serving, and that's our guest. We are here to serve our guest every single day. And if we have a server who's going to come in every day and not be behind that value, or a line cook who's not living into those values, or someone who doesn't believe in sustainability and is going to secretly go out back and throw plastic into the trash because they just don't care, that doesn't align with who we are. But you can walk right down the street and find another restaurant job where you can be aligned with that value there. And it's tough. I agree. It's the hard conversation. But we train our managers and we train our leaders that it always starts with education before we move to, I give up on you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think so often it stems from a lack of foundation of clear expectations and alignment of what we're looking for and what we prioritize. Because if you haven't verbally communicated that or been able to showcase that, how can you expect someone else to behave that way, right? So, Kurt, anything to add on that front, especially when we think about, which the next topic I would love to talk about is the role of the leader, and especially how important leadership is as you grow and develop this operation. I like to be really intentional about the leaders you bring in and how they're behaving, because you're also going to have subcultures that potentially form and will form, especially as you go across different regions. Kurt, talk to us a little bit about leadership and that impact.
Yeah, what you're raising is I think sort of an interesting point. So you've all probably heard the phrase or saying that what you do speaks so loudly I can't hear what you say. Culture, there's probably no truer idiom to describe what actually drives culture when it relates to leaders. What leaders say about the culture they want maybe has 5% of the impact on what the culture actually becomes and is and evolves to. 95%, making up numbers, right? But 95% is how you actually behave, and particularly how you behave in moments of truth. Cultures get tested in very specific moments of truth, when a hard decision has to get made, when a failure has just occurred and how you react to it, when a great success comes along, right? When you're dealing with promotion decisions. Those are when cultures really, really get tested, and I think all of those things relate actually to the behavior of leaders. What you said, though, is very, very much true. Subcultures do exist in companies, and the larger the company is, the more likely they are to exist. My style, so Mark Frank, who is our founder and CEO of the company, has shaped the culture and creates and drives the culture more than anyone else, as you would expect. Mark manages and leads and deals with people differently than I do, right? We're different people. I have a different style than he does. And among my direct reports, I've got 5 VPs that report to me. Each of those VPs also they all have different styles. I don't want people to all be the same, right? But so the way they actually manifest and reinforce the culture is going to differ a little bit from person to person. And you'll have people sometimes that naturally gravitate toward certain teams and bosses because they're the people that they're most comfortable working with. I think that's totally fine, as long as the behavior of that leader at its fundamental level is still driving and reinforcing the culture that you're trying to create and build. And I think I can say with confidence, when I look across the executive team at Sondermind, every one of us, while different, behaves in a way where what's being signaled to the employees in the company, whether they work for me or work for somebody else, and they're looking across all of us to see how we act, they're all saying, yeah, pretty consistent. It's clear what they want.
Go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, I have 2 thoughts on that. You talk about the behaviors of the leaders and how those show up. 4 years ago, COVID hit, and the restaurant industry was hit very hard by it. And I was brand new to Snooze at the time, and I joined Snooze because I was promised they are a people-first organization. That's part of who we are. Our guiding, North Star is our guest and our snoozer. And I remember I'm 4 weeks into my job, and I get called into a meeting as the HR person where we have to have a conversation about layoffs. And I was terrified going into this thinking, well, let's see if I don't get laid off because I was just hired. But walked into the conversation, and for 4 hours, we talked about the people. How are we going to take care of our people? How are we going to feed our people if we lay them off? How much pay do we give them if we do this? How does it impact that? How can we feed them 3 meals a day? 4 hours of people conversation. And then, how are we going to pay for it was the second question. And that's to go to the idea of how do behaviors show up. That's such a great example of behavior. Because our behavior that supports our culture, guided by our snoozers and our guests, started with the question, how do we take care of our people? And then we demonstrated it through the dialogue there. Before we moved to the important question, which was how do we pay for it? You can't do it without money. We know there's a symbiotic relationship between business and culture, but starting there was super important. The other thought that I had while you were talking was in relationship to the idea of subcultures. Your company can have a subculture, but you can have team subcultures as well. The subculture on my team, the people team within Snooze, is absolutely different than the subculture within the finance team at Snooze. Our team has we're driven. We have a same-day response time expectation because the nature of our business yields some behaviors and cultural elements, but it's still in support of the greater culture, which is in service of our snoozer and our guest. And even if you look at finance that may have a 48-hour turnaround time on their, how they get back to people, it still serves snoozers and guests in a different way. And it's interesting when you think about culture, you can have subcultures, but what you want to ensure is that the subcultures aren't in competition to your overall culture. And that's where you get the negative subcultures. If you have a culture of gossiping, if you have a culture of backstabbing, if you have a culture of these negative behaviors, that goes to that impact piece, because positive times a negative is going to equal a negative. No matter how good your foundation is, if you have those negative impacts, you're going to lead away from the culture that you're building.
Yeah, I remember one of the CEOs that's been a mentor to me from this InsurTech based out of Wisconsin, where I'm from. He really reaffirmed the focus on like culture add as they scaled out their leadership team in different departments on how foundationally they want leaders who are going to be connected to the 2 or 3 behaviors that they've identified and prioritized. But after that, they want leaders with a little bit of their own kind of competitive edge that's going to add to the culture throughout the organization. But it's not competing, like you said, with the overarching theme or culture that you're trying to embed throughout the company. Jeremy, can you keep talking about maybe navigating those subcultures, especially as you shared this story about, operating in different regions with their own local cultures, like, different coastals, or Atlanta, for example, I believe was a space specifically. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Atlanta was a fun story for us because an incredible market, an incredible food scene, and Snooze was super excited to go into that market. And what we didn't identify as we were first walking into there is 2 of our core main values are community and sustainability. And when we hired our first group of people in the restaurant and we said, throughout your day, you have to take the blue cap off the bottle and put it in the blue trash can, and you take the white bottle and you put it in the green trash can, and you scrape the food from here and you put it in the compost bag, and then when you go to the dishwasher, you can only spray 3 times because we're conserving water. The look on these people's faces was sheer terror, because they were not accustomed to this idea, whereas you walk into probably any restaurant in Denver and hire somebody, sustainability is a common thing we talk about around the Denver area. And so what we found in this idea of subculture is not only were we competing with now new people coming in and having to introduce them to our culture, we were competing with a core foundational lack of knowledge around something that was core and foundational to us as an organization. And so it's made it harder for us to recruit in an area like that, because we're not going to waver. We're not going to waver from our core cultural value if the region doesn't, lend that way or lean that way. Instead, we're going to now have to hunt even harder to find the people who are going to be aligned with what's core to who we are and how we show up for our guest and our snoozer.
Which I gotta imagine that's pretty hard to really stand to, especially if the market's calling for a certain type of behavior or value set. When I think about, especially if some of you are gonna be growing globally into cultures around the world, obviously there's gonna be some pretty large differences. I remember a project we worked on with a group that was opening an operation in Vietnam that values innovation and open feedback and communication and all these different values that we look for in a US-based team. The Vietnamese population do not practice that value set. So it's how do you try to maybe, in some ways you want to kind of introduce them to this value set and bring them in, but if you want to compete and grow in these markets, you also may have to kind of assimilate into their values, which, yeah, I'm curious, Kurt, have you maybe have any perspective on, as you're trying to maintain a culture that you hold dear and near to your heart as an organization, but at the same time, you're operating in other subcultures that maybe conflict with it. How do you navigate maybe those situations?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, the more of a mission orientation the company has, the easier it is to overcome cultural differences by geography, I would say. I'll go back and just use Nike as example, right? Sport is a thing that is common across the world. Different sports in different places, but there's common interest and passion about it. And the way sport is done is similar in different parts of the world. And so people who have a natural affinity for that world and want to be part of that company come with a set of kind of cultural predispositions that naturally give you a pretty good starting point, separate and apart from what you might be dealing with on a local level. I would say, though, that one of the things that we found there that affected us wasn't so much what we would encounter country to country around the world. I mean, there would certainly be different work practices. At our European headquarters, for example, labor law in Europe, you had to have a workers' council, and there was a lot of negotiation that would happen between, the management and this workers' council for things you'd want to do that would affect people in the company. So that was different. But the thing that I actually found that affected us the most culturally was consumer behavior and how it differed in different parts of the world. If you look at Nike today, if you follow the company, buy the products, watch the messaging, look at packaging, there's all this stuff on sustainability, right? Europe consumers drove that. Nike would not have been on that path had we not seen ourselves in a situation where we were starting to see a backlash from European consumers. Specifically, it started with this greenhouse gas that we were putting in the air cushioning units in shoes. And it was a greenhouse gas because, without getting too technical, we needed this really high molecular weight because otherwise they went flat, right? And so we had to go through a 5-year engineering effort basically to figure out how to keep an airbag inflated with nitrogen as opposed to using this greenhouse gas. And then you talk to consumers about that, and then faith is sort of restored, and then that goes to packaging and a whole bunch of other things. This changed the culture of the company as a result of what the consumer basically demanded. So those changes can come geographically, not just from cultural differences in different places and the employees that you deal with, like you guys did, but also from the people who buy your product and force you to change, or you lose their business.
Yeah, that's incredibly difficult. And I think about, so then what's the strategy? How do you start to evolve your language, your strategy of implementing different solutions into these spaces? And both, obviously, we're realizing this affects you both internally with your own team and organization, but also externally with your consumer base, reaffirming the importance of foundational mission and purpose, right? So I'm excited to kind of maybe start to transition, like how do we continue to nurture culture to be a strategic element of the business that provides an impact and an ROI, and it's actually an element of performance. And also just to open up the floor, like happy to take some questions if anyone wants us to dig deeper, if they have any specific situations they could use some feedback on, just raise your hand and we can call on some people here. I think we have, about like 15 or so minutes left. Yeah, you want to jump in?
Please forgive me. It's very fascinating to hear how you've gone about applying culture into the organizations, both of you. How do you link culture and performance in a meaningful, tangible way? If you do, what does that look like?
To just repeat the question, how do we link culture and performance in a tangible way? Super easy question to answer.
Super easy. No, I think the important thing to remember is that your culture drives performance. So the behaviors that you build through your culture, the norms that you create, the connection that you create with your people to what you do, how you do it, and the systems, the tools, and the processes, all of that drives performance ultimately. And so if I was sitting in front of Kurt as a president of a company or a CEO, trying to tie those two things together, the way that I would tie it is the work that we put into our culture gives us the ability to perform at the level that's being asked of us. And there's a true ROI that you can actually tie directly to that, because the output of that comes in engagement. The output comes in the effort that's going into the productivity that you're looking to get out of that, and then ultimately that performance metric.
I also like to just add another definition to culture just to help sometimes make it more tangible. It's like, in a way, culture is just a reflection of your behaviors within the organization. So then you want to backtrack and say, okay, what behaviors are going to help us perform at the highest level? And how do we start to create those behaviors within our organization? And now you have a connected culture between performance and the culture that you have. So I think sometimes we have things that we want to perform really well, and then we say, well, we just want to be we want to have a good, healthy, happy workplace, and we're going to behave in a way that reflects happiness and things like that. But we don't take that extra step of saying, but are these the behaviors that are going to allow us to perform at a higher level?
I think there's an interesting thing that comes with that behavioral piece as well, and it's a reminder that culture is not free massages, ping pong tables, beer Fridays. Those are
nice.
They're
though.
nice, and they're
Hold on.
But your culture is not defined solely by those behaviors. It's defined by the behaviors that actually support the growth and the success of the organization. Now, those are behaviors that do support other things. They're perks. They're things that are going to drive engagement. They're tools and systems. But it's also just, as you were saying that, it was that reminder, like, behaviors are actually tangible, actionable things with an output greater than some of the cool things that you get to do.
Any other questions? In the back? Yep. Yeah. So the question is, like, especially in those early stages when you're bringing new people into the organization, how do you intentionally create it without allowing it to just, or because you will form a culture regardless if you do it intentionally or not, right? So do you allow it to just happen organically in its own way, or do you intentionally do it in the beginning, and how do you do that? So, yeah, fellas, any thoughts on how do you intentionally do that from the beginning?
I can give it a try. I mean, as an investor, saw most of the companies that I worked with would create fairly early on some description of their company values. Those values, if thoughtfully created and described in clear enough terms that you actually knew what they meant, were a pretty good foundation, I think, for starting the process of shaping a culture. They, of course, don't have much impact unless the leadership behaviors, how decisions get made, how things are dealt with in those moments of truth actually are consistent with the values. I would say the minority of the companies that I worked with really drove those values into the operating DNA of the company in such a way that culture was intentionally crafted as a result. I do think oftentimes company culture early on is organic. It just sort of happens. And I actually think that's okay as long as the CEO, especially when you're young, is paying close attention to how it's developing and making changes and mid-course corrections as things are emerging that don't feel quite right, or you want to poke at something that you really want to push on and accelerate, right? I think the organic development is actually kind of fine in some ways. And I think that's the way Sondermind developed. We're a culture that is based on being a startup and a fast-moving startup and wanting a culture like that. But it's also driven a fair amount by the business that we're in, and because it's a very mission-driven business, we're in the business of mental health. We have, we are disproportionately attractive to people whose lives have been affected by mental health in some way, either personally, a family member, whatever. So they come to the organization with this very, very high affinity to the mission, and that puts some elements of the culture a bit on autopilot, I would say, and that was the case from the very beginning. So I don't know if that was a coherent response to the question, but it's what came to mind.
I definitely think it was coherent, and I think an important thing to think about within that is what are the behaviors that you can early define that matches the culture that's being created, and when you're looking to bring on new talent, how do you align them with those behaviors? If in your early phase, you need to be driven, you need innovative people, you need creative people, depending on your business, whatever these words are, you're gonna define yourself. But when you're looking for talent, you're gonna look for people who have the behaviors that are supportive of that general culture that you're creating, even if it's not fully defined or well-defined at that early phase.
Yeah, no, this is great, and I think sometimes in the early stages, you're going to define like your non-negotiables, right? Like these are things that are foundational to you as a founder or a leader. And then I totally agree. I think there's something beautiful about and really engaging about allowing the organic kind of natural elements come in and build in the early days. So,
You have one Truac in the back.
yeah.
Thank you for a great panel. I have a question, or rather an advice, because I'm in a phase where my company is growing, and for the first time, as we have positioned ourselves as a nice place to work in, we are facing interns that really want to stay, and we have a situation where those that really do best work have also started to exhibit some behavior that is not very friendly to our culture, and we are a bit surprised to see it. So how would you act in that way? Because you mentioned that education goes first. How long do we give them time and communicate that no backstabbing or competitive behavior is allowed to work as a team first, before we say, no matter how good work you do, if you're not a team member, we don't want you on.
Wow, that's a powerful question, and congrats on reaching that stage. First of all, that's really exciting. So the question was, we've reached kind of a stage of development that we've become a stable workplace, a good place to work, but now we're experiencing these tensions between like non-productive behaviors to the culture and the organization and productive ones. So like, especially, and that's really tough too, especially if they're high performers, right? And they're contributing to the business, and you're like, well, they're a high performer, we can't really lose them because this is crucial, but at the same time, long term, it might have some really negative impacts to the future. So what do we do about that, right? Jeremy?
Yeah, putting my HR, this is my favorite HR question to answer. Putting my HR hat on, the first piece of advice that I would give you is the damage that that person is causing today is going to be longer lasting than the pain that you would have by eliminating the problem earlier. So you have to have the courage and the fortitude to say, yeah, getting rid of this high performer is going to hurt for a couple of months until I can find another high performer. But the longer you keep them there, the deeper that cancer is going to become as a part of the organization. And so I would encourage any leader to lean into the fear and understand that there may be pain with it, but the quicker you take action, the better it's going to be for the greater good. The second piece of that I like to always think about is aptitude versus attitude. And when I think about any employee that works for you, you can have the aptitude, but the most important thing is the attitude. And we always, consider 51% attitude, 49% aptitude. So you can be the top performing, best person here, but if your attitude is not aligned with what we're trying to accomplish, I recognize that that's gonna hurt the greater team. And what you could wind up doing is losing those top other two performers because of the negativity that's created from that scenario. So it starts with the coaching and make sure that they clearly understand the expectations and make sure that you have clearly communicated in a way that they do. So always do that by communicating the expectations to it and then having them repeat it. Help me understand what you just think I just said and what behaviors you're going to demonstrate that are now aligned with the expectation here. When that doesn't take form, then thinking about a general HR practice of do you go from coaching to written disciplinary determination, kind of a 3-step practice, or you can be snooze and we have a 5-step practice because we give you a lot of opportunities to get better because we really love our people.
It's really hard though, so give yourself some some slack on that one. But yeah, they can be vampire suckers to the organization, right? And a cancer, right? They're slow killers to the morale and the engagement.
Yeah, I would just reinforce a personal lesson learned for me as a young CEO years ago. I put a lot of emphasis in my own mind on how the business actually sort of ran, and had a lot of beliefs about putting in place kind of standard processes and repeatable work and all this sort of stuff. Came to the realization fairly quickly that the people decisions I was making, my direct reports in particular, there was almost no limit to the amount of greatness for the company that could be accomplished by just choosing the right person for a critical role. What I also learned is the converse is equally true. There was almost no limit to the amount of damage that could be created inside the company by having a person that was bad in a role, in a leadership role, critical leadership role. And unfortunately, the amount of time it takes to recover from that damage is hard and long. And so when you see that happening, act fast, right? You will save yourself an enormous amount of pain later.
All right, we got time for one more question. Anyone over here?
Yeah, I'm just curious what, I'm not sure if snooze is, your employees are remote, like I think some of mine are. What effect do you think remote work has on culture, and how you've been able to fill those gaps?
So the question was more around how does remote work affect culture, and how might we start to look at that piece and that, like, work with that piece. So
You don't have a lot of remote work. We have some, but you probably have more than me.
We have a ton of remote work. We went from being pretty much exclusively Denver, going into COVID, to now having, what is it, like 47, 48 people out of 220 or so that are Denver-based. I'm going to express a personal bias here a little bit. I hate remote work. I think we found out, fortunately for us collectively, that we were able to make remote work surprisingly well, right? Through a set of circumstances that could have been incredibly devastating to companies, the economy, and people as individuals. We figured it out. Culture development and reinforcement in a remote environment is incredibly difficult to do. So what we have concluded is the only way to overcome that problem is to force regular occasions in which people have to get together, right? Some sort of an event or a meeting or a summit or an offsite or whatever that just forces the getting together to happen. I just left to walk over here 3 days of an offsite of what we call our extended leadership team. It's top 45 or so people in the company. I've been in the company 9 months, and that group's never been together. And the difference in how the place felt and how that group felt and how the culture was advanced after just 3 days was marked, right? It was unmistakable. So I personally think remote work makes cultural development and reinforcement hard by definition. And I think the only way to really strongly overcome that challenge, partially, because I don't think you can fully do it, is just by having regular occasions in which you engineer people getting together. I don't know any other way to do it, honestly.
Yeah, and something I would add to that is sometimes with leaders that we're working with, we've reframed it as less of something to be solved and more of something to be managed. Because like Kurt said, I think it is really hard to actually solve that challenge. And we've gotten to the point where it's creating intentional gatherings, but then also being extremely intentional about every single touch point that you have, whether that's the one-on-one call, the group meetings, the communications that go out. Everything has to be, I guess, have another level of strategic intentionality on it to help reinforce whatever type of value set and culture and behavior that you want, because it is so difficult. So that's a huge problem, challenge out there. All right, well, I think that wraps us up. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us, everyone. We really appreciate this. Hopefully you got some value. Thank you.